Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off by thanking all you loyal listeners yet again for joining us this weekend. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, October 25th, 2025. We begin with Sister Luyanda Kaboka, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, we're going to begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by Adam Robner, Associate Professor of English at the University of Denver and author of the book The Jew Who Would Be King, a true story of shipwreck, survival, and scandal in Victorian Africa. Then, we're going to be relaying a special interview being brought to you by Janine Jackson, host of CounterSpin radio show presented by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, aka FAIR. Sister Jackson is bringing us an interview with Mumia Abu-Jamal, touching bases on a variety of relevant past and current events, so please stay tuned for that. And lastly, we're going to bring you right back here as Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by David McNally, Cullen Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston and author of the book Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Talib Kweli with High Tech, Roy Ayers, Thelonious Monk, Hank Mobley, Count Basie, and Slide Hampton. Now, people get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Adam Robner.
Alafia. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat historical calendar with significant dates and events of our struggle, African people struggle, women's struggle, people of color struggle, the working class and peasant struggle for the week of October 25th. October 23rd, 1952. England declares a state of emergency in Kenya to stop the Mau Mau rebellion led by Dedan Kimathi of the Gikuyu Land and Freedom Army. Mau Mau was a blood oath to destroy the English colonialists and return Kenya to African rule. October 24th, 1917. Victory of the Russian Revolution under the leadership of V.I. Lenin and the birth of the first modern socialist state. The Russian Revolution took one of the poorest semi-feudal countries in the world and within a 30-year period transformed it into one of the two superpowers of the world, eliminating starvation, disease, and homelessness, and provided critical internationalist support to all of the anti-colonial movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. October 24, 2005. Rosa Parks dies. She was the leader of the Montgomery, Alabama branch of the NAACP and a graduate of the Highlander Folk School and Education Center for Workers' Rights and Racial Equality. With a long history of activism, she refused to move to the back of the bus to make room for whites. She was arrested, tried, and convicted of disorderly conduct as well as local ordinances. Though many Africans had resisted segregated facility throughout the South, this was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and a 381-day bus boycott that galvanized mass protests throughout the U.S. against segregation began tearing down the walls of de jure or legal segregation to be replaced by today's de facto segregation. October 25th, 1983. The United States invades and recolonizes Grenada. Grenada, an African populated island in the Caribbean, provided fierce resistance, though it is one of the smallest nations in the world, being invaded by the most powerful nation in the world. Grenada was the jewel, together with Cuba, of socialism in the Caribbean, under the leadership of Maurice Bishop of the New Jewel movement. October 25th, 1882. Ha Song Hwang, a Korean activist in Hawaii who led the struggle against the so-called picture brides, young women who came to Hawaii through arranged marriages to European and Japanese businessmen. October 28, 1879. Luisa Capetillo, a Puerto Rican women's rights advocate, labor leader, and journalist. She organizes the first protest against United States corporate exploitation of labor in Puerto Rico. She was active in New York and Puerto Rico, where she criticized the mostly middle-class white feminist movement for its reformist moderations and inattention and inability to relieve the conditions of poor and oppressed nationalities. October 29, 1850. Candelaria Figueredo, a Cuban patriot, who at the age of 16 was the first woman to fight in defense of Cuba from Spanish domination. October 29, 1956. Israel, Britain, and France invade Egypt in order to stop the nationalization of the Suez Canal. This has been Sister Luyanda for Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California, and streaming live worldwide on the web at www.kpfk.org. We want to sincerely thank you for all your contributions on donations during our recent KPFK fund drive. Please join us wherever you are in our chant of resistance to racism, capitalism, and sexism by repeating this South African chant of power to the people. Amandla
awethu,
Amandla
awethu,
Amandla
awethu.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Adam Robner, Associate Professor of English at the University of Denver and author of the book, The Jew Who Would Be King, a true story of shipwreck, survival, and scandal in Victorian Africa. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Radio Los Angeles, Adam Robner.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It's a pleasure to be here with you, if not in physical form, at least virtually.
Ditto. So why did you produce this book?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't have a great answer for you, except to say that I'm a person who's really interested in a story. I like to chase down a story and figure out how things happened, why they happened, and I love a good narrative. So I wrote the book basically because I had a question. I had stumbled upon a reference to a so-called Jewish Zulu king from a speech in 1907, and I immediately started trying to figure out what that reference was to, who that person was. And in the course of my investigation, I uncovered what I thought was a hell of a good story, and I wanted to chase it down. And that's why the book exists, because I chased it down.
So the character in this book, Nathaniel Isaacs, was of British Jewish ancestry and somehow left home at an early age. And one of his initial encounters took place in St. Helena, the island where Napoleon, the attempted executioner of Haiti, was exiled. Do you have anything to share about Isaac's relationship with Napoleon?
Well, they didn't actually meet because Napoleon died in 1821, first half of 1821, and Isaacs didn't get permission to travel to St. Helena until 1822. The island of St. Helena, which is really a small volcanic outcropping in pretty much the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, kind of midway between Angola and Brazil, was Napoleon's place of exile. It was really a giant prison camp run by the British military and the East India Company. Now, Isaacs had an uncle, Saul Solomon, who lived there, and he became a wealthy and influential member of the white European descended class of St. Helena because he traded with Napoleon, became a confidant of Napoleon, and actually exchanged correspondence to and from Napoleon with his supporters in Europe. So although Isaacs himself didn't know him, his uncle did. Many Jews in Europe, and including in England, which was at war with Napoleon, actually saw in Napoleon a quasi-messianic figure because he had granted Jews civil rights, emancipated them wherever he had conquered in Europe. And so Jews were very supportive of Napoleon, and I think that may explain how Saul Solomon and others in that family ended up having a close relationship with Napoleon.
So your character, Nathaniel Isaacs, winds up in South Africa on the Indian Ocean coast. And there he encounters the well-known leader of the Zulus, speaking of Shaka. And in fact, he writes about Shaka, and a good deal of what many people know about Shaka comes from what Mr. Isaacs wrote. My question is, did he exaggerate, for example, with regard to Shaka's purported brutality? And what precisely was his role in Zululand in any case?
Right. These are great questions, Gerald, and I'll sort of take that, what you said, and break it down into two. So I should point out that Isaacs arrives in St. Helena when he is 14 years old. So he's a teenager. He works for his uncle on this island for 3 years, learns the ins and outs of the import-export trade, and then undertakes a speculative voyage to Cape Town, which is on really, the Indian Ocean Atlantic coast, I guess we could say, roughly. From Cape Town, he discovers that his friend's friend has gone missing. And he's an adventurous soul, our now 17-year-old Isaacs. And so he travels with his friend, James King, in search of their friend, Francis George Farewell. They end up shipwrecked in what is today the bay outside of Durban, just where Durban, the city in South Africa, rests. They were shipwrecked. They are kept alive by the Zulu. They become familiar with Zulu ways and customs. They undertake some business with the Zulu. And when Isaacs is a few months into his, I guess, maroon there in what is today Durban, he undertakes a trip to meet King Shaka, and that begins their relationship. They knew each other. Isaacs is living there for about 6 years or so. He undertakes several trips to visit with King Shaka, to meet with him. He details those in his book. That book is called Travels and Adventures in East Africa. It's published in 1836, and it is the first published eyewitness account of the Zulu people. Now, obviously, the Zulu and other groups nearby knew about themselves and about the Zulu, but for Europeans, this is a new encounter. This is a first contact moment, we can say. And Isaacs begins to write this ethnography of the Zulu. He describes their ways of living, their modes of marriage, their hunting, their fighting. He describes them overall in extremely positive ways, which I think is unusual for the time. But you're right, he does dwell on King Shaka's supposed brutality. Now, do I think he exaggerated? Yes, I do. I do think that Isaacs probably exaggerated. We do have other accounts of brutality on the part of King Shaka from Zulu informants and also from other tribal groups' informants in an archive of oral history. So to me, this is a question of, yes, Isaacs is important, and did he exaggerate? Yes, he probably did. There seems to be evidence to indicate that he did.
And I take it that the book that he wrote has lost copyright and therefore it can be found online.
Yes, Travels and Adventures in East Africa is available online, Google Books, probably in various formats. And it is a good read, and it is a fascinating read to see this young man struggling to understand a very alien way of life and coming to appreciate it in many ways, but also being critical of it in many ways.
So Nathaniel Isaacs somehow winds up in West Africa near Sierra Leone, and he becomes a warlord, I understand, becomes a slave holder, I understand, and also it is suspected that he was a slave trader. With regard to the latter, where were these Africans transported? Any transported across the Atlantic? Any transported across the Sahara? And give us a snapshot of his other activities in West Africa.
Okay, yeah, let me explain. He writes this book and publishes it in London. And part of the reason he publishes this book is that he has received, or he had received, or said he received, a grant of land from Shaka. He wanted to exploit that grant of land and tried to encourage the British to colonize what was then called Natal, and that area that borders we could say the historic Zulu kingdom. The British were not interested at that time in colonizing that area, and so they rebuffed him. Remember, this is a 20-something-year-old Jewish guy of no pedigree who is trying to convince the British to use their might of empire and their bureaucracy to take over an area that they see little promise in. So in frustration, Isaacs writes this book based on his journal that he had kept during his years on the fringes of the Zulu kingdom, and that had been adapted into newspaper articles published in Cape Town around this era. This book then is expanded. It's 2 volumes, and it is widely read and received and reviewed. But it's not enough to get the British to colonize. So again, this frustrated young man turns to what he knows best, and that's the import-export trade with Africa. He finds a position in a trading firm that deals with West Africa, what is today the Gambia, and they trade in rare goods up into Mauritania. Isaacs ultimately finds his fortune in Freetown, which is a thriving crown colony of liberated Africans who had been released from slavery by the British West African Squadron mostly, various groups, very heterogeneous group. And he trades in peanuts and other palm nuts and other oils. He is deputized by the governor of Freetown to undertake negotiations to outlaw the slave trade with regional kings. He does so. He actually negotiates 9 treaties to end the slave trade. So we have a story of someone who is very admiring of the Zulu, and especially the fact that they never dealt in slaves, who is deputized by the British government to end the slave trade regionally. And we see a descent into avarice and into brutality. He takes up with women who we call them Euro-Africans. That's often how it's referred to in the scholarship, part European, part African. These women have roles in slave trading dynasties in the areas north of Freetown, also south of Freetown in today's Liberia. And he learns another trade, which is the import-export not just of peanuts and palm nuts, but also of human souls. Whether or not he actually traded sort of locally in what we could call arguably a sort of domestic slavery, which had long existed in that part of Africa and West Africa, or whether he actually indulged in what we call the chattel slavery of capturing people, buying, selling, and shipping them transatlantically. It's not entirely clear. I believe, based on the sources I found, but this is an extrapolation, that he did have dealings with slave traders who worked in Cuba. And so presumably some of these people would have been sent to the New World.
Finally, Adam Robner, Associate Professor of English at the University of Denver, author of the book, The Jew Who Would Be King, A True Story of Shipwreck, Survival, and Scandal in Victorian Africa. You've mentioned that there was a, quote, surplus visibility, unquote, with regard to Jewish participation in the African slave trade. What did you mean by that?
So this term surplus visibility, it's a concept. It comes, I believe, from sociological literature, and it's something that not only Jews but other minority groups feel, or maybe the better term is fear, or have an anxiety about. They don't want themselves to stand out, and so they have a concern about, or an anxiety about, surplus visibility. They are a minority, and so anything they do tends to reflect badly on any member or perceived member of their group. This is something we're all familiar with, even today in America, or especially today in America of 2025. So in point of fact, and this is contrary to a lot of myths and allegations that we read, Jews did not have any particular or large role in the slave trade, in the transatlantic slave trade. Certainly there were people who were involved. It was a business. Everyone was complicit. But Jews maybe had a surplus visibility because of their minority status. That means they were more visible precisely because they were more marginal. They were less of the population. That's how I described it in the book.
Well, sir, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
We're now going to send you over to CounterSpin Radio, hosted by Janine Jackson, who's being joined by none other than Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Welcome to CounterSpin, Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you never know what folks are learning for the first time. So I just wanted to start with noting that you are a journalist. Mumia, listeners should know, was a radio reporter at various Philly stations. He was head of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. I sometimes think once you're a witnesser and a storyteller, you can't turn that off, even if you become the subject of the story. Certainly you have never really stopped doing what you started out to do, have you?
I have not. I guess old habits die hard.
So you've continued to listen and report and to speak from whatever position you're in, because a journalist is what you are, yeah?
Yeah, but, in a cultural sense, I think of myself as a griot, probably a progressive griot, but a griot nonetheless. In African culture, griots were the people who remembered the history of the tribe, and really they served prince in power, but they served the tribe as well. And there's an old tradition that's talked about in Senegal that when a griot dies, you don't lay him in the ground, you bury him vertically in a tree so that he and his stories are remembered. I think about telling the stories of a different kind of tribe here in America, a tribe of rebels, a tribe of people who struggle, a tribe of the poor and the oppressed, because those are the stories that rarely get heard and get reported in much of the world.
Well, that leads me directly to what I just saw on Wikipedia, which said, quote, from 1979 to 1981, he worked at National Public Radio affiliate WHYY. The management asked him to resign, saying that he did not maintain a sufficiently objective approach in his presentation of news, close quote. And it gives me a giggle. And I think that while news media has in important and life-altering ways gotten much worse since then, there is in some places anyway a growing recognition that objectivity is a myth and a harmful one, and that we are all enriched by reporters who can bring their whole selves to the job.
If you're not bringing your whole self to the job, you're not doing the job. Mm-hmm. And I think that this whole objectivity myth began when the art of journalism, I won't call it a science, but the art of journalism was professionalized. And, before that, of course, the media was a very political entity. I remember reading in a history book, it might have been Howard Zinn or something like that, a New York newspaper called the New York Caucasian. I mean, think about that. Papers were printed by unions and churches and other kinds of groups. And it reflected of the people who printed it, not the people who paid them, because, journalism was more of a work that people loved doing than a quote-unquote profession. Howard Zinn warned us about the dangers of professional distance in many fields, as an historian, of course. Howard Zinn learned history not when he earned his PhD at Columbia, but when he was teaching at a black college during the civil rights years. And he was teaching pre-law or something like that, and he was telling people at the school about how the Constitution protected them and they had certain rights. They would say, excuse me, Professor Zen, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, you know, you have the right to do this and do that. He said, we don't have the right to vote down here. He said, what are you talking about? He said, if we go to the voting office, they will beat us up. He said, who will beat you up? He said, the cops and everybody else. So Howard Zinn followed his students to the voting place, and he sat and he just looked, and he learned something that he had never learned in college. And this was Atlanta, of all places, that when people tried to register to vote, they were refused. They had these ridiculous tests they gave them, and if they did not walk away, they would be beaten and locked up. And so Howard Zinn learned that which the profession did not teach him, that history isn't always written in these documents or in books. They're lived by people, and we have to pay attention to how people live in the real world to tell their stories.
You know, of course, what reporters may tell us the law is, what I get from that story is that an article can tell you the law says this, and that's not the same thing as telling you how the law is lived out in various people's lives. And we have a journalist right now, there are many, but I will just say Mario Guevara, who apparently has an Emmy Award, but it's not enough to prevent his having been detained for over 100 days now, for the work of live streaming law enforcement activity, including ICE raids. You know, so we have a journalist doing what a lot of other journalists would say is what they're supposed to do, and he's been detained. So when people hear generically about journalism is under attack, well, no, it isn't all journalism that's under attack. It's a particular kind of witnessing.
Well, that's actually true, but also think about in this era, this time, and I'm speaking right now about the, shall we call it, the Kimmel affair. Mm-hmm. And how everybody is talking about First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of the press. The case you describe is the unfreedom of the press, where journalist is captured and caged for telling stories and streaming stories about government repression. Who do you think gives a damn about the Constitution, the government or the people?
Well, let me ask you, continuing with media, I think people read the data point, 2 million people incarcerated in the U.S. or more than that, more and more every day being put in detention centers. And they're shut away from families and friends by procedure, by distance, but also shut out of public debate and conversation. And I think there's a feeling that this is a cost to those people who are imprisoned, but there's less recognition that there's a cost for everyone when we don't get to hear from this ever-expanding and various group of voices. And I think journalists who buy into, wittingly or not, the idea of out of sight, out of mind, they're serving someone. They're serving something by excluding the voices of the incarcerated in our public conversation.
Well, yeah, they're excluding not just the imprisoned, who, as you said, are in the millions in the United States, but also they're excluded from thinking about what it means to be truly American, you know, because this is part of that. There is no space in the American land space where the shadow of the prison doesn't fall. And that's because it is so huge, it is so vast, that it impacts those within and without, because everybody in the prison has someone on the outside of prison that loves them or they love their children, their mates, their parents, you name it. And, you know, that shadow falls on all of those people. You know, there are stories that can enrich our understanding of what it means to be human by allowing people in this condition to be heard as full human beings.
Well, I could talk to you a lot, but I don't want to take too much of your time. I want to ask you, certainly before we close, to say anything that you want to say to a listenership of media critical folks. But I would ask, I read a quote from you recently that you said you've never felt alone. And I think that is gratifying and probably surprising for people to hear, because many people walking freely through the streets are feeling very alone right now, really oppressively alone for all kinds of reasons. And it might seem a weird question, but in September 2025, where are you finding hope? What are you looking to?
I do find it in young people who are more open and more receptive, not just to stories, but to struggles. And I think that the gift of repression is that it wakes people up. I mean, people are seeing things that haven't been seen in this country for years. And it's waking people up. And so, once you awake, it's kind of hard to go back to sleep. Mm-hmm. And think about this, to the right wing, the worst thing you can be is woke. So that suggests that they want everybody to go to sleep. So wake up, be woke.
We've been speaking with Mumia Abu-Jamal, author of many titles, including Writing on the Wall, Faith of Our Fathers, Murder Incorporated, and 1995's Live from Death Row, translated now into at least 7 languages. Mumia Abu-Jamal, thank you so much.
All right, you're back here on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM, and we're going to keep this train a-moving and send you right back over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined this time by Professor David McNally. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is David McNally, Cullen Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston and author of the book Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, David McNally.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure to be with you today, Gerald.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you produce this book?
Well, really in many ways, I was watching the so-called turn to political economy among historians in the United States after the 2008-9 global financial crisis. And there was a growing interest in understanding the economy in a way there hadn't been during the so-called cultural turn among historians, going back 40 years or so at the time. But what I noticed was 2 things. First, that they were focused overwhelmingly on the financial sector, and they were not talking about the labor process. They weren't talking about the actual production of goods and services. And secondly, that while many of them were granting that slavery in the so-called New World seemed to be associated with capitalism in some way, they were really focused on the ways in which enslaved people maybe were used as collateral for mortgages and things like this. But I didn't see any really significant attention to the ways in which enslaved people in the U.S. South, throughout the Caribbean, Brazil, and so on, were actually producers of some of the most significant global commodities in the world. In other words, it was upon their labor that capitalism was built. So I was really trying to add to the picture of understanding capitalism as a global system and the centrality of enslaved people within it.
Mm-hmm. So, as you know more than most, Eric Williams of Trinidadian extraction, Walter Rodney of Guyanese extraction, Joseph Inekuri of Nigerian extraction, and Marx himself have written of capitalism and slavery. So, what is new about the McNally version of capitalism and slavery?
I suppose what's new is really the following. You will, of course, know, given your eminence in the field, that when Eric Williams wrote his initial doctoral thesis that became Capitalism and Slavery, his mentor, C.L.R. James, objected to him that the workers were nowhere to be found. That, in other words, he'd done a very good job of showing how British banks in particular were deeply invested in both the trade in enslaved people and in the trade in commodities produced by enslaved labor. But C.L.R. James essentially said to him, where are the laborers themselves? Where are the enslaved people? And so Williams belatedly added a chapter on that to Capitalism and Slavery in response to his mentor, C.L.R. James's criticism. And I think in many ways, I'm taking off from that insight that C.L.R. James develops, and of course he pursues it in his own book, The Black Jacobins, but also another and parallel inspiration is W.E.B. Du Bois's insistence that decisive to the Union victory in the Civil War in the United States is what Du Bois calls the general strike of the slaves, the mass withdrawal of labor by way of flight from the plantation system, and then, of course, the nearly 200,000 formerly enslaved men, newly freed men, who enter both the Union Army and Navy. And so I'm really trying to build on that to do more than just have a chapter the way Williams did. Inekuri and others are brilliant as well, picking up on Williams' insights and demonstrating how deeply invested British capitalism in particular was in enslaved labor and in the trade in enslaved people. But his focus as well is not really on the enslaved people. Walter Rodney, of course, is a very different story, and he is an inspiration for this book because he writes his classic history of the Guyanese working people. And so I would include Rodney as one of the inspirations for what I'm trying to do here in really centering both the way in which enslaved people in the New World were producers of capitalist wealth, but also in the utterly historic centrality of their resistance to transforming the world in which we live.
So what are the implications of your thesis that plantation enslaved formed a modern working class? For example, scholars, including myself, have suggested that one way to look at the enslaved in North America is as a kind of unpaid sector of the working class whose class interests at times diverge from the interests of the overall working class. For example, during the War of 1812, when they joined the British invaders, Washington, D.C. What are the implications of your own thesis?
Well, I suppose at the most general level, it is that we need to rethink and rewrite labor history by way of centering this chattel proletariat. One of the things I do try to argue quite forcefully is that these workers on plantations regularly use strike action and forms of collective organizing that the great Jamaican historian Mary Turner said really meant that they engaged in forms of collective bargaining. But equally important, maybe more so, they were the innovators of the general strike, of the mass strike. We tend, I think, incorrectly to attribute the origins of the mass strike to European workers. But in fact, and as you brilliantly know, we were just celebrating the anniversary of the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution last week, but so many commentators miss the fact that when the French reinvaded in 1798 under Napoleon, Toussaint Louverture called for a mass strike on the plantations, and the Haitian people delivered. From that Haitian event through the incredible uprising that we know as Bus's Revolt in Barbados in 1816, the incredible strike of about 30,000 enslaved people in Jamaica in late 1831, early 1832, the strike that essentially brings British involvement in slavery to its knees, all the way through to Du Bois's general strike of the slaves during the Civil War. I want to make the claim that these workers were the innovators in general strikes and mass strikes. And once we think in those terms, then the ways in which labor history has been written have to be overturned. And of course, and here I very much converge with the work of yourself and other historians in saying this means we need to be foregrounding racial capitalism as the breeding ground of class struggle. And that forces us to then treat racial differentiation and racial oppression not as some marginal note to labor history, but actually center it and argue that from its inception, capitalism in the New World was in fact racial capitalism, and the workers most intimately confronting racial capitalism were at the center of modern and global class struggle.
But you expand upon the question of African resistance beyond what you've already said. I mean, for example, you make a case with regard to the enslaved engaged in class struggle. However, settler colonialism, at least U.S. style, has involved a heavy dosage of class collaboration amongst the settlers across race lines. And I'm wondering if your work has any implication for that, and in any case, once again, elaborate upon the question of resistance.
Yes, and I think it does on the question of settler colonialism. It does have implications precisely because, as you say, foundational to settler colonialism is the idea and the practice of trying to integrate sections of the working class from the dominant social group into the settler colonial project, which, as we know, deeply compromises whole sections of the settler population, including working class sections of that population. If you can create complicity in the settler colonial project, you're essentially creating a form of racial privilege, which we've come, I think, correctly to call white supremacism, that disables a whole section of the working class from playing the sort of oppositional role that it ought to have. And as a result, I think it follows that the racialized and racially oppressed sections of the working class then become the central, if you will, even to use our older phrase, the vanguard elements of a working class movement. And I think, yes, in terms of resistance, it plays out in that regard as well, because those sections of a working class that are least compromised by settler colonialism, least integrated into a settler colonial project, are undoubtedly going to be those whose resistance is least hamstrung, whose resistance is most, if you will, determined and persistent. And so I think that it's not surprising that what we see the enslaved section of the New World working class doing is becoming the leaders, as I was suggesting earlier, in the most militant forms of social protest. They're taking a variety of African modes of cultural and social organization, adapting them to the plantation system, and then using them to forge new modalities of resistance, which I think we have yet to fully learn from.
Just as a footnote, Nick Clegg, a card-carrying member of the 1%, a former British politician who just stepped down from a top executive post at Meta, Facebook, has just published a book dissing his erstwhile Silicon Valley comrades, wherein he says that when you are accustomed to a life of privilege, equality seems like oppression. And that particular peculiarity may be trickling down to other sectors of the settler population. But having said that, what is the role of George Washington in your story?
Well, Washington's incredibly important because of not only the fact that he was a slave owner, which is well documented and well understood, but I try to show in the book that he was also one of the leading innovators in the development of planter capitalism, in the creation of a kind of agrarian capitalism based on bonded labor in Virginia. And that he was recognized as such, as a kind of premier innovator. Washington also, and this is incredibly interesting for the story of settler colonialism, because Washington builds his holdings, both of land and of bonded people, on two axes. One is as a participant in the so-called Indian Wars, where he is regularly being rewarded in land for his victories over indigenous peoples in the eastern United States. So he's an accumulator of land by way of dispossession of indigenous peoples, and he's a purchaser of dispossessed people from Africa, who he then mobilizes as bonded labor. So what's so interesting is that we see in Washington this convergence of both of these axes of settler colonialism: indigenous dispossession and exploitation of the labor of dispossessed indigenous Africans. And so through him, we can almost use him as a prism of the story of settler capitalism and plantation capitalism in the United States. And of course, given what an incredibly central figure he is in the story of the Revolutionary War and then the construction of an independent U.S. state, to center him in this way as a settler capitalist and a settler capitalist exploiting enslaved labor, I think forces a whole series of issues to the forefront that, needless to say, not all historians have wanted to grapple with.
Just as a footnote, in my most recent book, The Capital of Slavery, I got a peek at Washington's last will and testament. And what I found striking about it is that he must have been one of the largest landowners on planet Earth. I mean, the amount of land that he controlled, and of course, in controlling this land, he was overthrowing the so-called proclamation line of 1762-1763, wherein London had expressed displeasure at expending blood and treasure, heading westward, fighting Native Americans so that folks like Washington could profit handsomely. Which leads me to my final question, David McNally, author of the book Slavery and Capitalism. You are also the author of Blood and Money: War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire. What is that about?
Well, that's really an attempt to get people to think about modern finance, modern banking, and the creation of the global market in which we live today, not as something that, as in the Adam Smith story, emerges through the gentle practices of people trading one thing for another, but is instead something that is driven by state-based European war machines. That, in other words, the global market is created through war and colonialism, And in creating that global market through war and colonialism, and hence blood, there is the opening up then of the triangular trade with the trade in enslaved people captured through war making in Africa. So once we begin to see this process of war, colonialism, and slavery as those three as aspects of one single global process in which our modern world market and world economic system are created, then the whole story of money and banking is no longer benign, but is, as I argue, rather drenched in blood.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, David McNally, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Adam Robner, representing the University of Denver, and his book, The Jew Who Would Be King, A True Story of Shipwreck, Survival, and Scandal in Victorian Africa. We also give thanks to Professor David McNally from the University of Houston and author of the book, Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Much appreciation to Janine Jackson and CounterSpin Radio, as well as her guest, the one and only Mumia Abu-Jamal. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Sister Luyanda Kaboka on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, as well as our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Babadidan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And that's not all. You can also go to the audio archives at kpfk.org, scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. With that, we send you off, and until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people. Power to the people.